The morning sunlight spilled softly through the blinds, warming the living room just enough to catch the glint of the coffee steam rising from the kitchen counter. I perched on the edge of the sofa, my fingers tracing the ribbon of the gift I had carefully wrapped the night before. Today was their anniversary, and I had planned something special, something that I hoped would finally make my parents notice me, the youngest, often overlooked daughter. I had rehearsed every small detail in my mind. The placement of the gift on the table, the perfect moment to hand it over, and the words I would say. Every thought flickered with both excitement and a familiar sting of doubt. Would they even care? The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of cinnamon from the muffins I had baked, and our tabby cat, Whiskers, nudged my ankle in her usual impatient way. I chuckled quietly, brushing her off, thinking about how little these small, ordinary mornings seemed to matter to everyone else. Mom hummed from the kitchen, a tune she always sang when she was distracted, and Dad shuffled papers at the dining table, already absorbed in emails on his tablet. My older brother and sister were in their rooms, likely scrolling through phones, detached as usual. I swallowed hard, hoping my gesture wouldn't just drift into the background like so many others had. I carefully folded the napkin in a leaf shape, a small symbolic detail I had always used in my preparations, and set it next to the gift. It seemed silly, but somehow, it carried my hope. I moved to the kitchen, adjusting the breakfast plates and smoothing out the tablecloth, imagining the expressions on my parents' faces when they saw the surprise. My heart raced, not with pride alone, but with that gnawing feeling of invisibility I had carried for years. The thought of being acknowledged, truly seen, made me grip the edge of the counter a little tighter. I rehearsed the reveal, a soft smile playing on my lips. I had learned to anticipate reactions, to think 3 steps ahead, a survival skill honed over countless overlooked holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries. I whispered to myself, today will be different. They'll see me. When Mom finally called us to the living room, I felt a flutter of nervous excitement. Dad's usual distracted smile was there, but his eyes barely looked up from his tablet. I cleared my throat, feeling the weight of all my previous attempts to be noticed. My brother lazily entered behind me, tossing a casual greeting, and my sister followed, humming an indifferent tune. The room smelled faintly of coffee and muffins, the sun highlighting the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I positioned the gift carefully on the center of the table, making sure the ribbon lay just so. My hands trembled slightly, a mixture of hope and anxiety. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, presenting the gift with both hands. "Happy anniversary, Mom and Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. At first there was a pause. Then came the scream, sharp and terrifying, "Save my daughter," and... My chest froze, my stomach dropped, Whiskers bolted under the couch. My parents' eyes widened, panic etched across their faces, and my siblings froze, unsure whether to move or stay still. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I tried to process what had just happened. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to respond, but I was stunned, unable to reconcile the words with the moment I had envisioned. As the initial shock settled, a subtle, cutting undercurrent of criticism reached me, an implication that my efforts, my careful planning, were somehow misplaced, even laughable. A flicker of humiliation burned in my chest as I realized that my parents' reaction wasn't just surprise, it carried an edge of blame, a suggestion that I had done something wrong without even knowing how. I glanced at the folded napkin, the small leaf, now feeling like a fragile emblem of my vulnerability. The muffin's aroma suddenly seemed heavy, oppressive, the sunlight too bright. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the ribbon, heart racing, mind scrambling for what I could have done differently. I tried to gather myself, forcing my body to move, to speak, but the words faltered. Memories of being overlooked, of countless times my contributions went unnoticed, flickered unbidden through my mind. Each memory stung, layers of old resentment and hurt pressing against the raw, present pain. My parents, still caught in the panic of their own voices, seemed oblivious to my turmoil. My brother and sister exchanged a quick glance, their indifference almost louder than any words could have been. The ribbon in my hands felt heavier, a tether to both my hope and my disappointment. I retreated to my room, letting the door click softly behind me. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I ran my fingers over the gift ribbon again, a small anchor to the emotions roiling inside me. Confusion, frustration, and a simmering resolve mingled, each wave stronger than the last. I replayed the scene repeatedly, trying to find a clue, a misstep, or even a hidden message in their reaction. Something in the corner of the room caught my eye, a corner I hadn't noticed before, a small detail about the gift that I had overlooked. My mind snapped to attention. Perhaps there was more beneath the surface than I had thought, and maybe this day, meant to celebrate love, would reveal truths long buried in the family's routines and silences. I clenched my fists, feeling a determination harden within me. Today was the beginning, whether they realized it or not. The late morning light streamed through my bedroom window, soft but insistent, as if reminding me that the world hadn't paused for my shock. I sat cross-legged on the bed, fingers idly tracing the crumpled ribbon from the gift I'd presented earlier. My heart still thumped from the morning's chaos, the memory of their screams looping over and over. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the strange mix of alarm and faint judgment in my parents' reactions. It wasn't the first time I'd felt overlooked or dismissed, but today's incident gnawed at something deeper, something I hadn't confronted in years. My thoughts turned inward, cycling through flashes of previous holidays and birthdays when my efforts went unnoticed. Yet each memory carried its own subtle sting rather than exact repetition of the morning's events. I drifted to the doorway, peering down the hallway where my brother lounged, tossing a casual comment about breakfast as if nothing had happened. My sister followed suit, humming lightly and disappearing back into her room. Even Mom and Dad moved around the house with distracted ease, their focus still on routines and work, leaving me suspended between hurt and disbelief. Every glance, every tone of voice seemed to carry an unspoken dismissal. I noticed how Dad ignored the placement of the napkin, how Mom's eyes flicked past the gift, and the way my siblings barely acknowledged my presence. The leaf-folded ribbon in my hand seemed to pulse with meaning, a small echo of the effort I had invested, unseen and unappreciated. I realized then that the incident wasn't isolated. It was threaded through the fabric of everyday life, subtle but pervasive, a quiet betrayal I could no longer ignore. I wandered to the living room, pretending to check my phone, but really observing. Patterns emerged. Mom praised my siblings' small achievements in ways that felt casual but deliberate, while my own contributions were minimized or forgotten. A fleeting glance, a slight tone of annoyance, a quick change in conversation, they all added up. My mind raced as I cataloged each instance, piecing together motives and relationships with a precision I hadn't acknowledged before. Then came a seemingly trivial remark from my brother. "I guess some things just aren't worth noticing." The words were casual, almost careless, but they sparked a realization about deeper favoritism, a network of subtle exclusions that had been quietly shaping my life. My pulse quickened as I absorbed the implications. These weren't random oversights, they were patterns, and patterns could be understood, anticipated, and eventually confronted. I decided to test the waters, engaging my parents in light conversation while keeping a careful watch. I cracked a joke about a minor mishap from last week, gauging their reaction. Dad smiled faintly, distractedly, while Mom responded with polite brevity. My siblings interjected at the edges, their comments light but pointed, measuring my responses as if I were a puzzle to solve. The internal tension was palpable. I balanced my hope for recognition against the fear of another emotional blow. There were micro moments when I thought I glimpsed connection, Mom's fleeting nod, Dad's half smile, but each was quickly undercut by subtle dismissals or interruptions. I realized that immediate validation was unlikely. Instead, understanding the dynamics, mapping alliances and oppositions, was a strategy far more valuable than seeking approval in the moment. The afternoon shifted into a shared lunch, the family gathered around the table, conversation flowing with the usual banter and quiet undercurrents. I contributed an idea for a new home project, only to watch it subtly co-opted by my brother, who reframed it as his own. My hands clenched under the table, but I said nothing aloud. I observed, noting every detail, the way my suggestion was slightly modified, the smiles exchanged around me, the ease with which my input was absorbed and redirected. The sting of unacknowledged effort ignited a growing resolve. These small betrayals weren't merely annoying, they were data points, insights into the invisible hierarchies that governed our family interactions. I made mental notes, cataloging who could be counted on, who remained neutral, and who would need careful strategy to address. By late afternoon, I returned to my room, settling at my desk with journal in hand. I wrote with deliberate focus, parsing the morning's chaos and the patterns that had emerged since. Names, gestures, remarks, tones, each logged with care, each forming the backbone of an internal strategy. My emotional state shifted from raw hurt to controlled determination. The ribbon from the morning's gift rested beside me, a tangible reminder of both vulnerability and focus. I visualized potential scenarios, rehearsed responses, and contemplated how to assert myself without provoking unnecessary conflict. Each scenario felt plausible, and with each, my confidence quietly strengthened. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room, I caught a fragment of conversation drifting up from the living room. My ears pricked. A whispered comment, faint but deliberate, hinted at yet another oversight, another manipulation I hadn't detected. My mind raced, heart quickening, not with fear this time, but with anticipation. The anniversary incident, I realized, was merely the surface of a deeper, more intricate pattern of subtle betrayals that stretched back further than I had imagined. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a detail that could change everything. I woke to the early afternoon sun spilling into my room, a quiet reminder that the world outside hadn't paused for my thoughts. Stretching, I tried to shake off the lingering haze from the morning, but the patterns I'd begun to notice kept cycling in my mind. Each slight, each dismissive glance, each casual misattribution from my family was no longer isolated. They formed a lattice of subtle undermining. I thought back to the minor achievements at school and home that had quietly been redirected or claimed by others. My contribution to Dad's garden planning, my idea for Mom's anniversary brunch, small things, yet repeatedly erased from acknowledgement. My chest tightened as I cataloged each incident, a mix of frustration and alertness sharpening my awareness. I traced the web of relationships in my mind, mapping allies, neutrals, and antagonists, realizing that recognition from them would never be handed freely. It had to be earned through strategy, not expectation. The folded napkin from the gift remained on my desk, a faint echo of my unrecognized effort, fueling my resolve. Stepping into the living room, I approached family interactions with deliberate care, observing micro-expressions and subtle cues. Dad's casual remarks carried unintended weight, Mom's distracted smiles hid judgments, and my siblings' gestures hinted at quiet alliances. I tested the waters with small comments, light humor, even casual questions about plans, all while gauging their reactions. Each micro-reaction confirmed suspicions I had quietly formed. The household's dynamics were skewed, favoring certain members while minimizing my contributions. A passing remark from my sister, offhand yet cutting, confirmed my fears. I guess some ideas just aren't worth remembering. The words hung in the air, trivial to them, but they confirmed a deeper manipulation I hadn't fully recognized. My pulse quickened not from fear, but from the clarity that emerged. The game was larger and more calculated than I had imagined. Retreating to my room, I sat at my desk, pen poised above my journal. I organized observations, each note a building block in a strategy I hadn't dared fully form before. I divided my family mentally, those who might support my presence, the neutral parties whose allegiance could shift, and the antagonist whose actions had to be anticipated. I replayed past mornings, lunches, and conversations, seeing them now as data points rather than personal failings. The ribbon from the gift lay beside my journal, a small, tangible reminder of persistence and careful planning. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, feeling a growing determination. The stakes were no longer about small recognitions. They were about asserting presence, establishing boundaries, and responding with foresight. Later, the afternoon light deepened as we gathered in the kitchen for a shared snack. I watched the micro-level interactions, noting how my suggestions were ignored, how my ideas were subtly reframed by others, and how comments intended to be innocent carried hidden agendas. Each slight was cataloged in my mind, reinforcing my resolve to act strategically. I engaged with measured charm and quiet intellect, observing responses and testing limits without overt confrontation. The tension thickened, small provocations layering upon each other, revealing implicit hierarchies I hadn't seen so clearly before. It was clear that today's minor slights were part of a larger pattern, a carefully maintained balance of influence and oversight that had been cultivated over years. Returning to my room once more, I journaled extensively, processing the afternoon's observations. I identified triggers, possible leverage points, and ethical boundaries, contemplating how to assert influence without causing unnecessary conflict. Each reflection strengthened my composure and inner resolve. The morning's subtle betrayals, now linked with the afternoon's revelations, underscored the complexity of our family's dynamics. I visualized scenarios, rehearsed potential responses, and allowed myself a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The emotional anchor of the gift ribbon reminded me of the effort I had invested and the recognition I deserved, not as a plea, but as a calculated assertion of presence. As shadows lengthened and the house quieted, a misplaced document on the kitchen counter caught my eye. It was subtle, easily overlooked, yet something about its placement seemed deliberate, a clue revealing yet another layer of hidden agenda. My pulse quickened with anticipation. The morning's chaos, the subtle dismissals, the family's hidden maneuvers, it all led here. I realized that this wasn't just a small slight or isolated incident. The household had its own covert game, and I was now aware of the rules. It wasn't just a small slight this time. I realized the game was bigger than I ever imagined. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room, but my mind was anything but calm. I replayed the subtle interactions from earlier, each glance and half-smile now illuminated as potential tests, each casual remark carrying hidden weight. My parents and siblings moved around the house with practiced routines, but I could see the invisible lines, the boundaries I had never dared cross fully. I remembered a moment during breakfast when my sister casually took credit for a small suggestion I had offered on table arrangements. I hadn't reacted then, but now it hit me with sharp clarity, the small betrayals adding up like a quiet drumbeat in my mind. I made a mental note, cataloging each slight, each manipulation, and began drafting the internal strategy that would allow me to assert my presence without provoking immediate backlash. As I joined the family in the kitchen, I approached conversations carefully, speaking with measured tone and light humor, observing the subtleties in everyone's reactions. Dad's eyes lingered on my sister's comment longer than necessary. Mom's smile was polite but distant, and even my youngest sibling's nods seemed calculated to test my patience. I caught the soft roll of an eye, a fleeting smirk, and the slightest hesitation in speech. Each small cue was data, confirming the hidden hierarchies and silent competitions running through the household. Overhearing a brief exchange between my sister and our mother, I detected the edge of favoritism and the whisper of manipulation. The realization was subtle but undeniable. The surface calm of our home hid careful maneuvering and silent games. Retreating to my room later, I laid out my observations in a journal, each page filled with careful notes, hypotheses, and reflections. I evaluated ethical considerations, reminding myself that patience and prudence would be necessary to avoid unnecessary confrontation while still asserting influence. I replayed interactions in my mind, weighing potential outcomes, envisioning small moves that could shift perception without igniting direct conflict. The ribbon from my anniversary gift lay beside the journal, a quiet reminder of effort and resilience, tethering me to my own determination. My strategy began to take shape: measure, observe, and only act when the stakes were clearly in my favor. By evening, I rejoined my family for light activities in the living room, participating without exposing my inner calculations. I tested subtle boundaries, offering opinions on shared tasks, observing who noticed, who ignored, and who sought to undermine my contributions. Each micro-reaction was recorded internally, a growing map of leverage points and vulnerabilities. The household's hidden dynamics had become my chessboard, and I was no longer just a passive observer. I sensed the tension building, an unseen current running beneath casual chatter and routine gestures, hinting at the confrontations I knew were coming. As the day ended, I retreated once more to my room, journaling the findings and planning next moves. My mind cycled between focus and alertness, identifying which battles to engage immediately and which to postpone, always calculating for maximum effect. The subtle manipulations I had witnessed were no longer irritating quirks. They were patterns to exploit when timing was right. The small exchanges, the whispered comments, the minor slights, they had all been signals. And as I closed my journal, a faint sound from the hall drew my attention. A conversation paused mid-sentence, a glance exchanged too knowingly between my parents, and I realized that today's minor skirmishes were only the opening moves. I couldn't shake the feeling that today's small moves were just the opening gambit for a much bigger game. The evening air in the Houston home was heavy, carrying a tension that felt almost tangible. I lingered in the hallway, listening to the low hum of conversation in the living room, my mind piecing together the subtle aggressions from earlier. Each glance, each pause, and the way words hung slightly longer than necessary revealed patterns I had grown all too familiar with. My sister's smirk when she mentioned her idea for the anniversary centerpiece made my jaw tighten. It was a small thing, but it carried the unmistakable sting of appropriation. I cataloged each slight internally, weighing reactions, potential consequences, and the timing for my own response. Somewhere deep inside, a fire sparked, but I kept my exterior calm, allowing the tension to build strategically. I joined the family in the kitchen, speaking carefully, testing the waters with deliberate phrasing, tossing in humor and intellect to measure responses without overtly challenging anyone. Dad's brief frown, Mom's clipped acknowledgement, and my brother's subtle withdrawal confirmed what I already suspected. The household was a minefield of invisible lines and hidden agendas. I overheard a whispered exchange, something minor, yet loaded with implication, between my sister and my mother that hinted at another layer of favoritism I hadn't fully appreciated until now. I filed it away, recognizing that this was exactly the kind of leverage I would need to navigate future confrontations. Retreating to my room for a moment of introspection, I analyzed every interaction of the evening. I considered what would happen if I acted immediately versus maintaining a calculated silence. A silent warning approach seemed prudent. Small gestures, pointed comments, subtle reminders that I was aware without provoking outright hostility. My mind raced through possible outcomes, evaluating how each family member might respond and how I could maintain control of my own reactions. The ribbon from my anniversary gift, still resting on the desk, served as a quiet anchor, a reminder of my own efforts, patience, and resilience in the face of constant underestimation. Later, during dinner, I executed minor acts of assertiveness, a carefully timed comment, a deliberate yet polite correction of misattributed work, a measured smile that suggested I had noticed more than I let on. Each reaction was observed, the flicker of surprise in my mother's eyes, my sister's brief stiffening, Dad's glance that lingered just a second too long. I noted vulnerabilities, mental footholds, and the potential for influence without crossing into overt conflict. The household's subtle power dynamics had shifted, if only slightly, and I could feel the internal momentum tilting in my favor. As the night drew on, I returned to my room, journaling the day's events and mentally sketching the moves I would make next. Each slight, each observation, reinforced my resolve. I revisited my emotional anchors, the accumulated lessons of resilience, strategic patience, and the intelligence that allowed me to navigate this intricate web of family dynamics. I recognized that while tonight's confrontations were minor, they were critical building blocks, setting the stage for more significant, higher-stakes encounters in the chapters ahead. Then, just before turning in, I caught a movement from the hallway, a barely audible exchange, a glance between my parents that lingered too long, a subtle shift in tone. My stomach tightened. It was nothing overt, but my instincts screamed that this was the sign of a hidden agenda, something larger than the small skirmishes of the evening. I realized then that the smallest remark tonight hinted at a larger plan, and I knew the real game was just beginning. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across my bedroom floor, yet it did little to brighten the heaviness that lingered from last night. I sat at my desk, tracing the ribbon from the anniversary gift between my fingers, feeling the quiet weight of all that had transpired. Every glance exchanged, every subtle dig replayed in my mind as I tried to anticipate the day ahead. I reminded myself of the lines I was willing to cross and those I would never breach, calibrating each thought, each move, to assert control without surrendering my composure. A small smirk from my sister, while pouring coffee, hinted at another provocation. I noted it, mentally rehearsing my response, knowing patience was as much a weapon as confrontation. By late afternoon, I was ready to act with precision. In the kitchen, my words were measured, my tone calm but intentional. I addressed a casual misrepresentation about an earlier family achievement with a simple, pointed comment, letting it linger just long enough to register without igniting a fight. My brother's brow furrowed slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of my presence, while Mom's gaze darted for a fraction longer than usual. Then, unexpectedly, a comment slipped from my father, revealing a favoritism that cut deeper than anticipated, a quiet, calculated jab aimed to unsettle me. I absorbed it, noting the opening it presented for asserting my position strategically. The evening grew denser with tension as I maneuvered through the living room, balancing subtle resistance with careful observation. Each word and gesture became a deliberate test of boundaries. A minor disagreement about dinner arrangements became a quiet battleground. I suggested an alternative subtly, and their reactions, though restrained, exposed fissures in the household's usual rhythm. Internal calculations ran constantly. What to challenge now, what to hold for later, and with each measured interaction, my confidence solidified. I felt the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming presence without succumbing to the chaos around me. Later, as night settled in and the household quieted, I retreated to my private space. The day's minor victories and lessons were catalogued meticulously. The mental map of allies, neutral observers, and adversaries crystallized further, each slight recorded, each reaction analyzed. I reflected on the power of silent assertion, recognizing that my restraint had conveyed more than any argument could. The subtle acts of resistance were my statement. I would no longer be unseen, no longer dismissed. Each move was part of a longer game, a preparation for the inevitable escalation that lay ahead. Then, a faint murmur from the hallway caught my attention, a conversation punctuated with laughter that didn't reach their eyes. Something in the tone, the timing, whispered of concealed intentions and strategic posturing. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from awareness. The first true act of resistance had been made, yet the ripples were already forming, signaling that the storm I had long anticipated was gathering just beyond the door. I leaned back, fingers tapping lightly against the ribbon still on my desk, feeling the careful balance of patience and preparedness. Tonight's silence was a test, and I sensed the storm was gathering just beyond the door. The evening air hung heavy as I moved through the quiet house, every creak of the floorboards amplifying my awareness. My mind replayed the subtle victories and provocations from last night, tracing each conversation, each glance, each withheld acknowledgement. The lines between patience and action blurred as I catalogued the small cracks in my family's facade, those moments where their composure faltered and their favoritism or hidden resentment shone through. I noticed my mother's fleeting glance at my carefully arranged notes on the counter, my father's brief pause when I mentioned a past contribution, and the slight hesitation in my brother's response to a casual question. Each revealed a fracture I could exploit, but I reminded myself that timing was everything. One wrong move could escalate beyond control, yet I couldn't ignore the sense that the balance of power was shifting beneath my feet. By the time dinner was served, I was ready to test the waters. I inserted myself subtly into conversations, offering comments that carried just enough weight to elicit reactions without drawing overt attention. My sister's smile twitched, her expression faltering for a split second before she masked it, and my father's eyes lingered on me a moment too long, betraying an awareness I hadn't invited him to show. Then, in an unguarded moment, my brother muttered something under his breath, a revealing remark about favoritism I had not anticipated. It stung, but it confirmed what I had suspected. The house was a minefield of hidden agendas, and every interaction had stakes I needed to navigate carefully. I took mental note of the patterns, catalogued reactions, and adjusted my approach. The tension escalated further as casual exchanges grew more layered. Small provocations, an offhanded compliment given to a sibling, a dismissive nod from a parent, tested my composure. I responded with measured patience, letting the undercurrent of my awareness subtly influence the conversation. Each micro-reaction I prompted was a calculated move. Each moment of control I maintained was an assertion of quiet power. My internal monologue reminded me that this was not about immediate triumphs, but about establishing presence and demonstrating that I would no longer be sidelined or underestimated. I felt my confidence solidifying as I observed the subtle unease rippling through the family. Later, retreating to my room for reflection, I cataloged the day's interactions and rehearsed potential scenarios for the confrontations that were inevitable. My journal became a map of power dynamics: who held influence, whose words carried weight, and whose composure could be tested. I visualized strategies for leveraging these insights, balancing assertiveness with prudence and patience with calculated escalation. The day's subtle moves had already shifted the household's equilibrium, and I could sense the tipping point approaching. As I glanced toward the living room, I caught a brief, telling exchange between my parents, words half-spoken, eyes darting, a hint of unease that had been absent before. It confirmed my suspicion that the tensions were about to erupt, that my careful orchestration of resistance and observation was nearing a crucial climax. Every subtle action, every calculated maneuver had led to this precarious moment, and the storm I had been preparing for was ready to break. I drew in a steadying breath, aware that one move tonight could ignite everything, and I was ready to meet it head-on. The house felt charged, every shadow sharper, every creak of the floorboards amplified by the anticipation that had built all week. I had reviewed every interaction, every dismissive glance, and the hidden manipulations that had been stacking against me. My notes lay scattered across the kitchen table, evidence of subtle betrayals and overlooked contributions, reminders that the evening would demand precision. As I stepped into the living room, the tension was palpable. My parents seated with a casual air that barely concealed their unease, my siblings exchanging subtle glances that spoke volumes. Then came the revelation that shifted everything: a misplaced letter, an unintended admission from my father about past favoritism, a comment that pierced through the practiced calm of our family facade. My heart raced, but my mind was sharp. I knew the balance of power had tilted, and my preparation for this moment would be the defining measure of strategy and resilience. I initiated the conversation carefully, framing my words to highlight the inconsistencies I had witnessed. Each statement was deliberate, designed to provoke reflection without descending into chaos. My sister's attempt to interject faltered as she realized the subtle weight of my assertions. My mother's usual warm detachment was replaced by a tight-lipped pause, and my father's confident posture wavered ever so slightly. Then, unexpectedly, an ally revealed themselves in the form of my eldest sibling, who quietly corroborated one of my observations. This confirmation shifted the room's energy, further destabilizing those who had relied on silence and omission to maintain control. I felt the room's attention focus, the subtle tremor of realization passing through them as I calmly pressed my point with strategic clarity. The confrontation intensified as I introduced supporting evidence and gently exposed patterns of favoritism and exclusion. Every micro-expression, every hesitant word from the family became data points in my mental map of power. Their reactions were a mixture of shock and defensiveness, and I remained composed, asserting my moral high ground while demonstrating strategic dominance. The emotional impact of the revelations rippled through the room. There was anger, disbelief, and for me, a quiet triumph. I kept my voice measured, my demeanor steady, knowing that patience and composure were the true victories in this moment. The unexpected support had strengthened my position, allowing me to maintain both authority and moral clarity. As the evening drew on, I found moments to reflect internally, acknowledging the growth and resilience that had brought me to this point. The confrontation had exacted its emotional toll, yet it was also a testament to the intelligence, patience, and calculated assertiveness I had cultivated. I noticed small gestures of reconciliation from my siblings, subtle acknowledgments that we were navigating a new understanding of family dynamics. These micro-reconciliations reinforced my sense of validation, not from external praise, but from the knowledge that my strategic patience had borne fruit. I sat quietly, absorbing the satisfaction of controlled power and measured victory, aware that the night's events had irrevocably altered our relationships and hierarchy. Even as calm settled, the air remained charged with potential for further developments. I sensed unresolved elements lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the next opportunity to challenge or affirm the strategies we had set in motion. The house was quieter now, but the echoes of the confrontation lingered, promising that the consequences would continue to unfold. I allowed myself a slow, steady breath, knowing that the storm had broken, yet the aftermath would require vigilance, insight, and continued strategic engagement. The night had been decisive, but the full implications were far from over, and I remained poised to meet whatever came next with clarity and resolve. Morning light filtered softly through the blinds, and for the first time in days, I felt a tentative calm settle over me. The night's confrontations had left echoes in every corner of the house, but now there was space to breathe and reflect. I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the outcomes in my mind, measuring what had shifted, what had remained, and how far the truth had finally reached. Then came the final twist. A quiet confession from my sister, a detail she had held back that validated every move I had made, exposing the subtle lies and manipulations that had been woven into our family's routines for years. It was a small revelation, but it carried the weight of proof, confirming my decisions and granting a sense of moral closure. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that I had navigated every shadow with patience and clarity. Though a trace of anxiety lingered for the unresolved echoes of past grievances. As the morning progressed, I encountered my parents in the living room. The usual defenses and guarded expressions had softened, replaced by a tentative acknowledgement of the truths laid bare the night before. I spoke carefully, allowing the evidence and prior interactions to guide the conversation, neither aggressive nor apologetic, merely firm. My father's attempt at denial faltered as the facts stood clearly before us all. My mother's quiet nod and a small, almost imperceptible smile from my eldest sibling conveyed understanding and respect for the composure I had maintained. Even my sister, once cautious and guarded, seemed to offer a hesitant alliance. These interactions, subtle as they were, reflected recognition of resilience and intelligence, an unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of our family dynamics had shifted toward fairness and transparency. Throughout the late morning, I allowed myself moments of personal reflection. The tension of the past days gave way to gratitude for the clarity I had earned, for the lessons in observation, patience, and strategic thinking. I thought about my own growth, the resilience forged in confronting manipulation, and the strength required to act without immediate validation, yet still command respect. The family was not perfect, nor were all tensions fully resolved, but there was a new foundation of recognition and honesty. Small gestures, a shared coffee, an exchange of words unburdened by hidden agendas, signaled the possibility of realignment, a measured reconciliation built on understanding rather than fear or pretense. By midday, I had begun to consider moving beyond the past. Plans for personal growth, renewed connections, and future ambitions filled my mind. The echoes of previous conflicts remained, reminders that vigilance and discernment were ongoing responsibilities, but they no longer dictated my emotional state. I realized that strength was not in demanding acknowledgement from others, but in knowing my own worth and standing firm in it. I could finally embrace the morning as a new beginning, carrying forward the lessons of patience, strategic insight, and quiet assertiveness into the rest of my life. The house felt lighter, not because all issues were resolved, but because I had claimed my own clarity and power within it. I stood by the window, watching sunlight spill across the yard, and for the first time in a long time, felt grounded. The past, with all its hidden agendas, betrayals, and frustrations, had taught me what it meant to remain true to myself. Every subtle maneuver, every moment of careful observation, every act of measured resistance had brought me here, to a place where I could move forward with confidence and insight, Today was not about triumph over others, but about the resolution within myself, the affirmation that intelligence, patience, and self-respect were the lasting victories. I finally understood. Strength isn't in being seen, it's in knowing who you are and standing firm.